About 40 years ago, a genre of movie came out called science fiction. When it hit the big screen, it really caught the imagination of a portion of the population. I wasn't part of that portion. Some people are intoxicated by the thought of the next sci-fi movie. Can't wait to watch it. But there's a vast portion of the population who just don't get it, don't understand it, and run a mile when they come out. Don't bother to waste the money on the movies. And I think that's the same sort of approach that society has to the book of Revelation. There are some people who are intoxicated by it and run after every nuance and thought and book that's written on it. But there's a vast majority of the population just don't understand it. I mean, most of us understand the first few chapters of the throne of heaven and Jesus speaking to the churches, and then at the very end, the new heaven, new earth. But those interleading chapters with all those strange personalities that parade across the stage, that's just very baffling. And so often people, will just stay clear of those complicated texts. Winston Churchill once wrote about the Soviet Union. He said it was a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. He just couldn't understand the Soviet Union. I mean, Calvin, the great theologian, out of all the books that he commentated on, he didn't bother even trying with the book of Revelation. And so we're about to start a series through this book, and we want to take away some of the mystery, look at the essence of what it is. You will see as we open the pages of the book, God says there is a blessing on those who read this book. And it's an unveiling of Jesus. It's an unveiling of his plans for the future. And so we want to go beyond just a little bit of information. Now, sometimes a little bit of information is enough just to make you terrified. I can remember when I got into the first aeroplane I ever flew. It was in a massive storm. And I was sitting near the window, and I saw the wings moving. No one ever told me aeroplane wings flapped. And so it caught me by surprise. And I played with my Scooby-Dooby wire when I was younger. There comes a time with metal fatigue where it breaks. And so I spent the whole 13 hours looking at this wing, wondering when metal fatigue would set in. I knew just enough to make me terrified. I can remember in the late 80s, early 90s, when barcodes first came out in supermarkets, and those numbers, those mysterious numbers that computers were generating. One or two old intercessors and grannies used to say they are the forerunner of the mark of the beast. And some even boycotted Pick and Pay and Checkers at the time when those barcodes first came out. I can remember once watching a movie when I was about 12 years old called Left Behind. And this story ran, lifted out of some thoughts out of the end times that this set of people was removed from the earth at the return of Jesus. And it was enough information to make me very nervous. And I remember lying on a rugby field one day looking up into the sky, and the sky turned blood red. It was winter time. Dust was in the sky. And suddenly I felt very alone. And we lived close to this rugby field. I ran home. I remember going to my house, looking for my mom and dad, and they hadn't come home from work yet. And I thought I'd been left behind. I had enough information to know that, something like that might be happening, and it was enough to terrify me witless. So our dream, our hope after the end of the preaching of the book of Revelation, and then it spurs you on in your faith. So what I'd like to do now is make 3 introductory comments before the preacher at your site gets down and deals with chapter 1. So the first one is, essentially the book of Revelation is a vision that John had, and this vision plays out in 2 domains. On earth, John sees earthly scenes, things that are unfolding in his world and in the world to come, and then heavenly scenes, what's happening in heaven. And so from the beginning through to the end, his vision moves from earth to heaven, and so there's an interplay between these two domains. So the question then needs to be asked, what is the link and what is the sequence? And that's where theologians disagree with each other and get a little bit tied up. So let me go very quickly with 4 schools of thought that explain the earthly and heavenly scenes. The first is a preterist school, which basically is looking at they say the book of Revelation is a historical record of 1st century Roman Empire, and the second coming culminated in the destruction of the temple in AD 70. The problem with that school of thought, though, is that the book of Revelation itself claims to be prophetic of end times. Now, we are more than 1,000 years beyond that, aren't we? So, but there are some serious theologians who take that view. The second school of thought is called the idealist school of thought, which says that the book of Revelation is all metaphorical. It's a timeless war between good and evil. And so the people who see it that way are removing the events of the book of Revelation entirely from reality. So it's metaphorical, it's a story about good and evil, and it has no connection with our world and our present reality. The third school of thought would call themselves historicists. So the book of Revelation is a sweeping view of history from the time of Jesus right up until present day. And what they spend a lot of time doing is connecting events in the book of Revelation with big events in world history, like world wars and the Nazi, and other military conquests, etc. The problem with the historicist school is that there's huge debate as to what each event signifies, and there's much conjecture and allegorizing as to what things mean and symbols mean. But there's some great theologians who see it in that way. The fourth and final school of thought is a futurist view of the book of Revelation. And basically, futurists would say that chapters 1 through 3 are historical. It was Jesus talking about churches that were existing. Chapter 4 and 5 is a look at the throne room of heaven, and the rest of the book is looking at the future. Some of it may have played out already, but it's essentially the future. It's a far simpler way of looking at it and looks at things quite literally. And so you might be asking the question, so what school are we going to position ourselves in? Well, we're not going to position ourselves dogmatically in any of them, other than to say probably somewhere closer to between the historicist and futurist schools. So in other words, we're recognizing it was written a few thousand years ago. Some of the events may well have outplayed, but essentially it's looking into the future. The second big issue I would like to look at is what the book of Revelation itself says about the benefits of studying the book. Because you might be saying, Grant, if it's so complicated, do I really want to study it? God encourages you to study this book. Let me read this text to you. Revelation 1 verse 3 says, "Blessed is the one who reads the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear it and take it to heart." The very last chapter, in 22 verse 7, it says, "Behold, I am coming soon. Blessed is he who keeps the words of the prophecy in this book." And so God claims that the book of Revelation is inspired by him. It's a gift of him to you, and it'll bless you when you read it. It'll bless you in establishing your faith. It'll bless you in your view of God. It'll bless you in your interpretation of your role in what God has for your plan in life. And it's a good thing to know the heart and the mind and the intent of God as you march into the future. And then the third and most important observation I'd like to make before we start reading this book is essentially, what is it about? Because there are some pretty strange creatures in this book. There are some weirdos that parade across its pages. And many books have been written about these anomalies and these different issues. I mean, you can find books of people flying in their sleep, about, the Antichrist's sign, about all different, sectarian and cultish organizations that are part of the end time conspiracies. You can read books that have been written about people claiming that people like Mikhail Gorbachev and others are the Antichrist. Some modern presidents have even been paraded in that queue. And so what essentially is the book of Revelation about? Well, Revelation 1 verse 1 says this: the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants. The book is from Jesus, about Jesus, and his view of how he will unfold the future. From Jesus, about Jesus, of how he will unravel the mysteries of the future. It opens chapter 1 with a presentation of Jesus and worship in heaven and on earth of Jesus. It ends chapter 22, a presentation of Jesus, worship and adoration of Jesus. It is a most exquisite and breathtaking view of who Jesus is, and a call to you and to me to worship him. Sometimes you'll see him as a lamb. Sometimes you'll see him as a king. Sometimes you will see him slain. Sometimes you will see him holding the world in his hands. It's a view of Jesus, by Jesus. And he wants to open our eyes to see he who came into this dumpy little town in the Middle East, who walked and who lived with you and me, who embraced the whole of humanity, who died and rose again and is now supremely in command of the world now and the future to come. And he calls through these pages. A call is made to you and to me to come and worship him. And this is the promise. He's returning. He's returning for you. He's returning for me. And he's returning for the world, where he will rebuild the world. He'll make a new heaven and a new earth. The future is in the hands of Jesus. And this book is not so much about the side characters and the dates that people get obsessed with. It's about a king who is supremely in command, who wants to make himself known to you.